Hello and welcome to this chess endgame, which features a bishop and pawn versus a bishop. And in this position, it is black's turn to move. And this ended up being a little trickier than I thought. But, what would you do if you were in this position? Right now, it's black's turn to move. How would you try and hold the game as black? And also, how would you try and win with white here? What should white do? But in this position, it's black's turn to move. So take a look at this. Pause the video at any time if you want to think longer. But let's jump right in here and check this out. And it was a little more tricky than I thought it was going to be. It looks like white should be winning with this extra pawn, but it's not so easy. So let's take a look here at the analysis and the evaluation here. White should be winning here, but black has to be careful white has to be careful because black does have ways to kind of trick white into getting a draw instead of a win. So let's see here. All right. So in this game, it looks like bishop to b7 or bishop to d7 would be two of the best ways that black can try and hold this position. It looks like white is trying to promote this pawn here, and black would like to just capture this pawn with the bishop. So things are a little tricky here. All right, let's take a look. It looks like we'll go with this bishop to b7 example first here. So bishop to b7, if black just blocks here, it looks like white is still winning, of course, but he has one move, bishop to d5, that he has to play, because it looks like if the bishop just moves away, well, then it allows the king up here to d8, and black does have chances for a draw here. So to get this win, bishop to d5 must be played here. Well, then we see that if an immediate capture occurs, well, then the king will just recapture, and if black tries to grab the opposition, white just moves over, and because of this pawn, black cannot move to c7 and hold the opposition against white's king. So after either king to d8 or c8, white will grab the opposition. So here's an example. Now white has the opposition. The pawn moves over, and if you're unfamiliar with the opposition, it's just when the two kings are opposing each other. With the easiest example is when one square is in between the kings, and whoever's move it is must move to the side or move away. So we'll see an example. Well, if we go back here it is black's move, and white has the opposition. So there's one square in between them, and black must give ground. So black moves over, white grabs the opposition again, and now black tries to stay in front of the pawn to keep it from promoting. But after the pawn is pushed forward, this squeezes the black king out from in front of this pawn off to the side, and white's king can move forward, grabbing control of this promotion square, and the pawn will be able to push forward and queen, and white would win easily after that. So if we go back to the very beginning here, and take a look at this bishop to b7 move again here. And after bishop to d5, so we already saw that black cannot win, or excuse me, black cannot hold the draw by trying to take this bishop. And, white is winning here, of course. But let's say bishop to a6 is tried to keep an eye on this pawn, this light square, so the pawn cannot push forward. Well, then we could have king to c6, and then after the black king tries to head over here and get in front of this pawn to prevent it from promoting, well, then we have bishop to e6 to keep this king out of these squares in front of the pawn here. And then let's see, after maybe bishop to d3. One other thing, though, that I would like to take a look at, the computer recommends bishop to c8. So that's one thing that, or one line I did not really look at in the game. It looks like white would still be winning, but the best move here is bishop to c8. So I just want to take a quick look at that. So here it looks like bishop to d5 is the best move. And then after bishop to a6 or king to e7, but we'll say bishop to a6. Well, then you have bishop to e6, and I don't know, this still looks quite difficult here. So bishop to e6, what happens if once again we have bishop to c8 up here? Well, now, what's another option? Bishop to c4, and then what happens here? It looks like the bishop must move, and if the bishop moves back, we'll use the recommended top move, bishop to g4. Well, then this allows the king to move in here and help promote, and this should be winning. If bishop to f3, well, then let's see, maybe king to b8. After king to d7, we have bishop to b5. This kind of drives the king away. King to d8 maybe, or d6. Then after this, yeah, very complicated stuff here. So I'm kind of digging, deep in this. White will have to try and swing his bishop around and oppose black's bishop. So let's see how this could continue. Maybe king to c5 attacking, but then we have this bishop to a6. And what can white do here? It looks like, or what can black do? White will get his bishop up here on this diagonal and oppose black's bishop, and this pawn, let's say something like this. Well, then bishop to b7, and now what? What can be done here? Let's see. Well, we don't want to let him capture this, so this bishop must move. Let's say it goes here. Well, now it's still tricky. This is like some pretty crazy stuff here. So it looks like um, if we move here, well, now this pawn must be protected. And black's bishop is threatening to move up here to c8. So let's take a look here. The computer recommends bishop to a6. Well then, what do we do? Bishop to e4 here. And then bishop to b7 is recommended. Interesting stuff. And here, I don't see what can be done. Let's see. Bishop to f3 is recommended. And now, oh, okay. Let's see. If he goes here, well then, we could play something like this possibly. And so now what? Okay, I should have seen that further. Now, if he takes, the pawn will march forward, and what can be done here? So this would be the winning idea. All right, I really dug into that, and a lot longer than I wanted to. So let's take a look back here. So back in this position, the game ended up going with king to b7 here, check, king to a7. And we see that the pawn and the white's bishop prevents the king from coming over here and trying to stop this pawn and get in front of it. So after bishop to f3, we have bishop to c4, and now the king tries to come over here to help stop this pawn, but there's a check driving the king back. So after the king moves, now bishop to b7, taking control of that square, this diagonal leading up to this b7 square. So once the bishop moves, we have bishop to d5, bishop moves over here, but now bishop to e6. And once again, if the bishop is captured, well then the pawn can push forward and promote to a queen, and white would be winning here. So yeah, that really went in depth there. I hope you were able to follow that. So let's look at another option here. It looks like the best option is king to d7 for black. So after king to d7, we have bishop to b5 check, trying to drive this king away. And then if the king just stays up here on d8, now we have king moving forward. But in this position, if the bishop just moves to h3 here, well then this will allow the king to come up here in front of the pawn, where, as we saw in the previous example, once the king gets over here, it can help push this pawn forward, and also with the bishop, take control of these squares in front of the pawn. Once the king moves to b7, the bishop, if the black king tries to move to c8, then the bishop can move over and check him away, and the black king won't be able to help as much. So after king to c6, we have, instead of the bishop retreating down this line, we have bishop to d7 check. And this is very interesting. So now the king, must move, of course. And so after this move, we see that the king is covering c7. And if the bishop were to capture like this, well, then the pawn would just move forward and promote, because now the pawn is cutting off the black king and white is cutting off this c7 square, so the pawn would just promote. So if we go back after king to d6, it looks like also, of course, if the bishop were to just capture on b5, once again, this pawn would just push forward. So another option is bishop to h3, but then we have b7, c8 here, and this is very interesting, okay, because now if a promotion is made with the queen here, it would lead to a draw, because the bishop would not be able to move, as a queen here would pin it to the king. The bishop here is cutting off this escape square, and the king is cutting off all the other escape squares. So a queen would lead to a draw here by stalemate, and also a rook promotion would. But there is one move here, b8 bishop. So promoting to a bishop is the only way to win this game here. And it looks like, what does black do after well, first of all, we'll look and see here once again, the king cannot move anywhere. Only the bishop can move. And so one example might be, and it looks like the best move is bishop to d7 here, and then check, the king must move, and now this bishop captures black's remaining bishop, and two bishops and a king versus a king is enough to win, and it looks like a mate in 13. So that was a crazy little maneuver there. So if we go back to bishop to d6, we see that bishop to c8 was played in the game. And then, let's see here, bishop to d7. Okay, so once again, the bishop cannot capture white's bishop, or b7 and pawn promotion will occur. So in the game, bishop to a6 was played. Also, we could look at, let's see, bishop to b7, but that would allow, let's see, bishop to e6, and what would be played next here? Looks like if the king moves away, the white king would be able to move over here, attack the bishop, and get in front and be able to help escort his pawn up and help keep this bishop away. So in order to avoid that, instead of bishop to b7, we have bishop to a6 here was played. And now bishop to f5 was played next, just keeping control of this line, keeping the black king away, and not allowing the black king to get in front of the pawn. And then the game continued, bishop to b7, but once again, if we had bishop to c8, well then capture, king captures, white would gain the opposition, and it would just continue with the same situation that we saw before. The pawn moves forward, squeezing the king out to the side, and then white takes control of the promotion square and would be able to promote to a queen and win. So, to avoid that, black played bishop to b7, and then after bishop to e6. Now, here, bishop to a6 was played, but if bishop to f3 were played, well, then we would have this, bishop to d5, blocking off this diagonal. And once again, if capture, king captures, taking the opposition, but then king to c5, and this is what we saw earlier. Black cannot take the opposition because of this pawn and would have to move up, maybe to d8 or c8, but this would allow white to take the opposition and win the endgame. So, after bishop to e6 by white, bishop to a6 was played, keeping an eye on this square in front of the white pawn to prevent it from pushing forward. But now this allows king to c6 to try and come over here and help this pawn. And the black king is shut out because of the pawn and king covering c7 and the bishop covering c8. And so the game would continue with the bishop having to move back here. Let's see. One other thing to take a look at. Let's see. What about instead of bishop moving down here to e2, let's see. What would happen if we tried this? Well, what should white play in this position? Well, now the top recommended move is bishop to c4. So that's one idea. Bishop to c4. Then well, here we see, once again, if this would occur, then black is forced to move his bishop or king. If the king moves away, then white would be able to come up here, attack the bishop, and what does the bishop do then? It has no squares to move to stay in front of this pawn. It can't go to a6. So the king is kind of forced to stay here. Let's see. Well, if the king moves over, all right, so the king cannot move. And now it looks like, what would we have next here? The bishop would be forced to move, but where does it go to? Bishop to g4 is the top recommended move. But let's take a look here. So white must be careful here. It looks like king to b7 is the only thing that works, because if this pawn tries to push forward here, and then we would have a check. So here's an example. This is a draw because of check. If we have a block here, well then capture. What does the king do? Capture, and then we have this. So, white must avoid that. And it looks like after this, and the bishop moves, it looks like king to b7 is the only move. So once again, this blocks out the king, and it helps get in front here to help escort this pawn up. And what would be the best thing here? It looks like if bishop to f3, well, then the king moves over here. If this happens, well, then bishop to a6, driving the king back to d8 here. And now bishop to b7, fighting for this diagonal. And so, what is the best move? Bishop to g4 maybe. But then what would work here? So if we had e4, now what? Looks like bishop to e2. But whatever happens, the pawn is going to press forward here. Maybe this would be tried. But let's take a look here. What about this right here? So now what? Now if the bishop captures, the pawn marches forward. So let's take a look finally at the end here. Let me go back. Where were we? Back again. All right, so king to c6. The bishop moves back here, threatening to check if the pawn pushes forward. So king to b7 must be played to help this pawn. And now we have check. King moves up here. The bishop keeps an eye on this square. And now bishop to c8 here. The king moves away, but now the bishop attacks. And so what then? Bishop is forced to move away. The king moves back. Black's king tries to do something here, but the game would continue with white's bishop retreating, keeping an eye on this promotion square, and nothing can be done here. The pawn will promote. All right, well, that was an example of how complicated an ending that looks simple, with an extra pawn and the same colored bishops. It wasn't opposite colored bishops, which can lead to a draw many times if the bishops are on opposite colored squares. But they were on the same colored squares, and white, even though white was winning, it was a lot of work to try and pull out that win. So take a look at this endgame again, and hopefully you can use the information from this chess endgame to help you win some of your own games. But it was a lot more tricky than it looked. All right, well, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you haven't already, feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.